Okay, this is the second half of the paper about the culture of Andalusia and the cultural trend or the powerful cultural history of the integration of Jews, Muslims, and Christians in Europe that we never hear about. Back in Spain in 1085, Alfonso VI, King of Castile, conquered Toledo and made it the cultural capital. He built a Christian church to commemorate his power, but structurally the church was completely Arabic. He was sending the message to his subjects that his city would be built on a culture of toleration. He began what turned out to be a century of the cultural hub of Toledo. He got the archbishop to approve of a school of translators and then hired translators who would translate works written in Greek into Arabic and Latin. He would revive the tradition that had existed there and had never completely died out. Good for him. At the same time, Christian scholars in Cordoba were reading, translating, and canonizing, which means creating, the Western intellectual tradition in the libraries built by Andalusian Muslims. To this day, the canonized tradition has not included Muslim scholars from Andalusia, even when it was they who wrote commentaries on Aristotle and knew the other canonized texts very well. Unfortunately, those with the power to choose ignored the cultural context within which they were making those choices. The canonized books from that era in Western intellectual history is dominated, even often monopolized, by Christian scholars. That really makes me angry. The situation in Northern Europe at the time might explain why. In 1095, while these scholars were hard at work, Pope Clemens declared a crusade to take back the Holy Land from the so-called infidel Muslims. Ironically, his notion of the infidel was either inspired by, or at least influenced, by the Muslim notion of the infidel. Islam has its original sin is infidel. It means, well, infidelity. It means not being grateful. In Islam, the worst sin, analogous to pride in Christianity, is to be an infidel. Infidel means to be ungrateful, to be created by God and live in a universe created by God, and to turn away from one's nature and one's situation. In summary, to be ungrateful for the undeserved blessings one is born with and born into. The scholars working in Cordoba should be accused of being infidels in relation to the influence of Muslims in the creation and maintenance of the cultural tradition they are now taking advantage of, much to the benefit of the development of Western culture. They were ungrateful. The people who marginalized, ignored, denied, silenced the Muslim part of the tradition were infidels, ungrateful. To make matters worse, Pope Clemens declared war on Muslims and called them infidels. It was a wonderful example of projecting one's own evils onto the other, shadow projection, onto someone else, of falsely idealizing oneself and falsely demonizing the other. Mennecal tells of another long-standing intellectual tradition in Europe that very few Westerners, including most scholars, were never taught. In the 12th century, Petrus moved from Andalusia, where he was born and educated, to Europe. His knowledge of Arabic, Latin, and the Greek intellectuals, standard practice in Andalusia, made him highly respected for his learning in Europe, where he was a rare breed. He wrote the Priestly Tales, a book of stories that simply expanded on the tradition of storytelling that was handed down to him in Andalusia. Boccaccio, Chaucer's teacher and mentor, wrote the Decameron in that same literary style. Chaucer's famous Canterbury Tales were most likely inspired, indirectly, by the Andalusian tradition, passed down from Boccaccio through Petrus. The original master storyteller, passed down from Persia to Andalusia via al-Rahman, was Scheherazade, great author and compiler of the Arabian Nights. In this genre, an enlightened teacher is trying to explain and pass on his enlightenment to those who are unenlightened, or less so. Reminds me of Socrates. Sometimes, or Buddha, sometimes the relationship is between a father and his son. In the case of Plato's dialogues, the relationship is between Socrates and his interlocutors, especially the youth who have not yet become hard-hearted and cynical. The teachers mix all genres together: doctrines, definitions, logical arguments, riddles, stories, morality tales, tragedy, comedy, the rational and the emotional, poetry and prose, art and philosophy. The one ambiguous moral of all storytelling is that there are no easy answers or unambiguous principles on the basis of which to live. Principles are too abstract and must be applied in specific situations. Frail and ignorant human beings misapply their own principles or fail to recognize which one applies best in a given situation, or they panic and react on emotion only. The stories are a mirror image of human life as people actually live it. Complex, confusing, full of degrees of good and evil people, making choices that are some combination of good and evil, some compromise between unattainable good and avoidable evil. The stories refer to God and claim that God is involved in human affairs in some sense, but that we cannot tell how God works, and we have to use the intellectual and emotional powers we have to do the best we know, continually seeking to gain greater enlightenment. Unfortunately, like many before him and many after him, in addition to the priestly tales, Petrus also wrote the Dialogue Against the Jews. Petrus himself was a Jew that converted to Christianity, meaning he either had a very informed understanding of Judaism, or he had a particularly poisonous disdain for the cultural legacy he inherited and then rebuked. Menachol describes the Dialogue Against the Jews in this way. It is, quote, an uncompromising and often vituperative theological polemic, offensive toward both the communities Petrus was leaving behind. This book is not merely an attack on Judaism, staged as a dialogue between Moses, representing the old religion, and Peter, representing the new religion. It is a wholesale, embittered abandonment of that entire community of civilized people who could read and write Arabic and its astronomical charts, Muslims as well as Jews. Unquote. As so often happens, no matter how many books were written that promoted intercultural dialogue, no matter how clear it was that the great philosophers and religious leaders would have unanimously favored toleration over intolerance, Petrik's book has been used since it was written to justify and increase animosity between Christians and Jews, as Petrus intended. This was not its only effect on European culture, claims Menachol. The book also, quote, became a crucial source of later anti-Jewish and anti-Muslim rhetoric. But at the same time, paradoxically, it contained a detailed and largely accurate exposition of both Judaism and Islam. It successfully introduced Christian Europe to a whole range of cultural and intellectual advantages that until then had been enjoyed only by Andalusians. It opened doors to a world where Jews and Muslims played a natural and vital role inside Christian polities. Back in southern Spain, from 11 to 1350, extremist Muslims took control of the entire area. Once again, ironically, they were given power by more tolerant and less barbaric Muslims in Andalusia. In Toledo, the Andalusian Muslim, who was overpowered by Alfonso VI, a Christian who reestablished and added greatly to the tradition, hired Muslim Berbers to overthrow Alfonso. Although Alfonso prevailed, the Berbers gradually gained the upper hand. They were followed by Almohads, a tribe of Muslims who were even more fanatical and barbaric. The story of this era is the story of Christians versus Muslims. The story of this era describes groups of self-defined Muslims who are extremely anti-intellectual, intolerant, and violent. Muslims who do want to take over power through the use of the sword. But this was clearly not the tradition in this era, and not respected by those who had dominated Muslim culture since soon after Muhammad died. Berbers publicly burned books by Muslim scholars, even al-Jarazali, whose views were orthodox, but still too liberal for the Berbers. The public rioted in response, fighting for their tradition of free intellectual inquiry. The Berbers tried to oppress the Muslim Sufi tradition, the mystical branch of Islam, because it was too heterodox, which is again against orthodoxy. The public again resisted. Judah Halevi was another great traitor to this tradition. After being born a Jew and being tolerated by the Muslims, he eventually demonized. That's nice. Thanks a lot. He was identified as one of the best and brightest young citizens, so he had access to the great texts and the great minds that congregated in the area. At age 50, he rejected it all. Menachal says he was a, quote, scion of this great tradition, who declared that it was all folly and inimical to Jewishness, and had to be forsaken, in spirit certainly, and, if possible, as he intended to do, physically, unquote. His book, The Song of Sid, portrays Sid, a Muslim, as entirely evil, and Alfonso, the Christian, as entirely good. The facts about their lives tell a completely different story. Both Sid and Alfonso fought on the side of both Muslims and Christians, depending on the circumstances. Alfonso fought against intolerant members of either tradition in order to preserve his culture of toleration. Halevi's book of refutation and proof on the abused faith rejects what is perhaps the cornerstone of this tradition and its greatest legacy, the union of reason and faith, reinforced by Aristotle's philosophy. Halevi claims that faith and reason cannot be united. If they cannot be united, there's no way to establish a philosophical bridge between the religions, a bridge that will explain why the religions should tolerate each other, showing the underlying common patterns and basic human condition and belief in God from which they all emerged. At approximately the same time, in the mid-12th century, Peter the Great, head of the Benedictine monastery at Cluny, and Bernard of Clairvaux, head of the Cistercian monastic tradition, represent two extremes that monastic Christians took in relation to Islam. Cluny was the largest Benedictine monastery, far larger than any other in Christendom. Peter had a reputation for being a liberal, or for agreeing with the union of faith and reason and the tradition of dialogue, rather than strict doctrine, in higher education and literature. To give one example, Peter defended Peter Abelard, who wrote in the philosophical style of give and take, reason and faith, even though the official church position was to call his work heresy. Peter publicly debated against Bernard, head of a new monastic movement, the Cistercians, who were both intolerant and militant, defending the Crusades as the will of God. Peter disagreed with Bernard on the role of reason, learning, and philosophy in the life and mind of a pious Christian. Peter wanted Christian scholars to know Greek so they could read the New Testament, Hebrew so they could read the Old Testament, and Arabic so they could read Greek philosophy and the Koran. The Pope, however, was moving toward the right, toward intolerance. Knowing the Christians in Spain celebrated the Mass in Arabic, the Pope initiated the Cluny reforms, trying to force all Christian churches to celebrate the Mass in Latin. Clearly, Southern Christians were demonized, and tensions between them and the Northerners increased. In light of this growing tension, Peter requested money to start his own translation project at Cluny, translating the Koran into Latin. The West had not yet translated the Koran into Latin, and Peter tried to get funding by claiming his motive was to support the Crusades by translating the Koran and then giving detailed arguments for why it was inferior to Christianity. Yet history has shown that Peter was against the Crusades. One can infer then that perhaps Peter's real motive was to find out the great value of Islam and to understand for himself the many bridges between the three religions of the book. He needed to know what the Koran said. He knew what he was looking for. The history of the Crusades themselves shows a much more complex interrelationship between the two religions and their cultural traditions. Than most histories describe. Many crusaders stayed in Palestine after they arrived, converted to Islam. We don't hear about that. The crusaders stayed in Palestine, converted to Islam, and became wealthy by making business connections with the Muslims living there. Various subcultures throughout Europe had long traditions of interreligious toleration and culture, resisting the dominant spirit during the Crusades, especially during the reign of Pope Innocent III from 1198 to 1216. Pope Innocent's extremist crusades were not only directed toward Muslims in Palestine, he also established an anti-Muslim crusade against all Andalusian Muslims, both tolerant and intolerant Muslims. He also incited Christian civil wars in northern Europe by establishing a crusade against the Albigensians. He chose Provence to hold his trials against members of any Christian sect that promoted toleration of other religions. Provence was the very place where the troubadours, inspired by the women from Sicily, trained in Andalusian culture, created the first canonical secular literature in the West. This weaving together is incredible. During Innocent's reign, after 150 years of Arabized Normans establishing an Andalusian-based Golden Age in Sicily, the area's luck ran out. Frederick II, Emperor of Sicily, Holy Roman Emperor, King of Jerusalem, knew Arabic and founded the University of Naples in 1224. Like the icons of the past, he focused his efforts on hiring translators to make the greatest intellectual texts accessible to everyone interested. He hired Michael the Scot to translate various Greek books, not yet translated, from Arabic into Latin, and books by Avicenna, Averroes, and Maimonides, great Muslim and Jewish intellectuals of their day. When Frederick was finally excommunicated by the Pope, he went to Jerusalem, where he was crowned king. His first act was to restore the Muslim call to prayer. When they heard it, all of Frederick's pages and valets rose because they were all Muslim. From 1236 to 1300, after defeating the fanatic Almohads, Christians ruled southern Spain and set up another wave of Andalusian culture there. Ferdinand took over Córdoba and Seville. Upon his death, He was buried in the great mosque of Seville, where his tomb has inscriptions in 4 languages. As part of his ultimate control of the area, Frederick II asked Ammar, a tolerant Muslim, to help him defeat the intolerant Muslims. In exchange for Ammar's success, he gave Ammar Granada. Ammar's Nasrids, the tolerant Muslims, kept the Andalusian tradition alive in Granada for 250 years. They finally gave over their territory to Ferdinand II, who passed it on to his heirs, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabel. The ceremony to celebrate this transfer of power took place in a mosque. The Christian monarchs were wearing Moorish clothes and promised to tolerate Muslims and Jews alike. A few months later, they expelled the Jews. Christopher Columbus, this is amazing, hired refugee Jews who knew Arabic. He assumed he was going to India and, based on his experience, the cultured people he would meet there would be speaking Arabic. The rest, as they say, is history. He didn't end up in India. We all know that. The 13th century in Paris also brought with it anti-Arabic fervor. Commentaries written by Averroes, the great Muslim scholar, were banned at the University of Paris. Latin translations with commentaries by Muslims and Jews were, quote-unquote, purged. These texts had been assimilated by intellectuals in Andalusia for 400 years. It was a great setback for the intellectual culture of the West. The Church rejected the union of reason and faith, the only solid foundation for religious toleration and the prevention of perpetual warfare and social unrest. Menekal stresses the importance of Greek philosophy in the development and maintenance of the Andalusian tradition. The intellectuals of Andalusia cultivated, quote, the deeply ingrained notion that Greek thought is transcendently valuable and that it is translatable into and compatible with any language and culture, including the monotheistic one of the children of Abraham, unquote. The great works of both Averroes, a Muslim, and Maimonides, a Jew, were based on an interpretation of the union of reason and faith that grew out of their readings of the Greek philosophers. Quote, the entire thrust of Averroes' efforts, and this was likewise the core of the work of his countryman and contemporary Maimonides, was to establish a model for the relationship between philosophy, which meant not just speculative thought, but rational and scientific thought on the one hand, and theology, or faith-bound thought, which accepted the teachings of Scripture and its official interpreters on the other, unquote. By the time of Averroes, Spain was controlled by scholars, including Al-Ghazali, who rejected any union of faith and reason, science and revelation. Maimonides and Averroes were condemned by the now dominant Muslims. Instead, intellectuals in Northern Europe picked up the tradition and became inspired by the idea that science and religion, faith and reason could be unified. In Paris, Alfred the Great wanted to integrate Aristotle with Christianity. Paris changed, following the tradition in Andalusia. His best student, Thomas Aquinas, following Albert's lead, wrote the Summa Theologica, a comprehensive and systematic worldview based on the integration of Christianity and Aristotle. At the time it was written, many of the propositions in it were almost heterodox and even heretical. Many of the propositions were banned until as late as 1325, right before Thomas was canonized. Not surprisingly, Thomas Aquinas was educated in southern Italy, where he was given an Andalusian-style education. That's amazing, because the Pope, the whole Pope's, all of his positions come out of a Thomistic framework. Many more seminal texts of the religious and intellectual tradition of the West had their origins, direct or indirect, from the culture of Andalusia, including the Jewish Kabbalah, the primary text of Jewish mysticism. When the Jews were exiled from Spain, the center for Kabbalism moved to Palestine. Second, the Book of the Ladder, written in Aramaic and presenting a Gnostic approach to Scripture. This book describes Moses' night journey from Mecca to Jerusalem, followed by his ascent up a ladder, guided by Gabriel, through hell and heaven. Dante's teacher read it. We can only speculate whether he showed it or described it to Dante, and whether it served to inspire Dante's writing of the Divine Comedy. I know where I'd put my money. Yeah, definitely. Ibn Khaldun, the most influential philosophy of history at that time, was educated in Granada and Seville. Chaucer traveled to southern Spain regularly because he had relatives there. He must have known the books in the old Arabic libraries that were translated into Latin. Beginning in 1492, familiar year, Jews and Muslims in Spain were ferociously repressed. Many converted, leading to fake lives. Fake Jews were called conversos, while fake Muslims were called moriscos. The old Arabic texts were turned into pulp and sold. Cervantes claims that the book Don Quixote de la Mancha was supposedly found in Old Toledo, written in Arabic and then translated by a converso from the old Andalusian culture. The Jews who traveled to the New World with Columbus were only the first of many. Many of the first colonizers were from southern Spain, which explains why Cuba and Southern California look like southern Spain. The style of architecture one can find in California and Cuba was begun by Abd al-Rahman in 775, who was himself homesick and trying to imitate the style he left behind in Damascus. The legacy of Andalusia will always be a legacy of religious toleration and the integration of philosophy and religion, science and revelation, faith and reason. During the Black Death, desperate people needed to find a scapegoat, someone evil enough to cause the wrath and punishment of God. Many decided that lack of true belief and the toleration of non-Christians was the cause. This extreme intolerance lasted for centuries and included the Inquisition. In 1991, skip a few, when a death sentence was issued by the Ayatollah Khomeini against Salman Rushdie for his book, Satanic Verses, Rushdie went underground and wrote a book, Harun and the Sea of Stories. Most readers and intellectuals did not realize that Harun was an Abbasid caliph and patron of the tradition of the translation of Greek philosophy into Arabic in Baghdad, as well as a character from the 1001 Nights, or the Arabian Nights. Rushdie's work was an affirmation and continuation of the tradition of moral storytelling, the long-standing tradition that began in Persia with Scheherazade. Rushdie's work was just one more tribute to the age-old tradition rooted in both Baghdad and Andalusia. In 1992, exactly 500 years after the expulsion of the Jews from southern Spain, the library in Sarajevo was destroyed, including over 1 million books and manuscripts. In the Oriental Institute, over 5,000 Islamic and Jewish manuscripts were destroyed. The memory of a cultural tradition is being lost. One of the books taken out of Spain in 1492 by Sephardic Jews who settled in the Ottoman Empire was the Haggadah, a book of prayers and stories to say during Passover to remember the Exodus. When the Nazis tried to destroy all remnants of Judaism, a Muslim curator in the Sarajevo library saved the Haggadah once again. September 11, 2001, opened yet another chapter in the long-standing tradition of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim animosity. Menachal ends her book with the admonition to choose toleration over intolerance. My reasons for including this long story should be clear by now. Today, Indonesia represents a cultural mecca for the tolerant strain of Islam. It is certainly far from the previous centers of tolerant Islam, Baghdad and Cordoba, but history shows that cultural traditions move from one place to another, and in our time, a cultural tradition can move to the other side of the world and still be preserved. Scholars in Indonesia were trained in the Mideast or West. The study of Islam, tolerant and intolerant, goes on in universities everywhere. The history of Andalusia should inspire Indonesians to reaffirm their political document, Pancasila, and the tolerant strain of Islam that all Indonesian citizens must embrace in order to fulfill their duties as citizens. My own training in Greek philosophy, particularly Aristotle, shows the important link between the greatest traditions of tolerant Islam in both Baghdad and Cordoba and the ancient Greek philosophers, especially Aristotle. This book gives specific reasons why Islam can be linked to Aristotle. Although I've not gone into the details, readers who know the stories of their religious leaders, Jewish, Christian, or Islam, should recognize the connections between Aristotle's virtues and vices and the moral teachings of those stories. The most influential aspects of the texts of the three religions of the book are the stories about Jesus, Muslim, Muhammad, or those who came after them. Most human beings learn more from stories than from systematic treatises or from moral admonitions. If I were to follow the tradition of storytelling as it was displayed by the ancient Greeks, I would refer to Plato, Homer, Greek mythology, and Greek tragedy. Like the other religious texts of this great tradition, the ancient Greeks used storytelling to show the complexities of life and to teach moral lessons that must be learned while facing those complexities. The Greeks reject oversimplified formulas for how to live. Their cultural texts present a vivid and unflattering image of human life as it is, good and evil, and how people must behave in order to be able to choose the better over the worse in situations filled with ambiguity and the need for compromise. The story of Andalusia should inspire Indonesians to continue to develop and maintain their cultural tradition. At this point in time, their society is controlled mostly by Muslim, but embraces citizens of other religious traditions and gives them the opportunity to serve in the highest levels of government and all other sectors of societies. Indonesians should see themselves as picking up on the legacy handed down from Baghdad and Cordoba with the hope of passing it on, not only to their own citizens. The success of Indonesia should inspire Muslims elsewhere who live in democratic societies, whether they are in the majority or the minority. Indonesians should show everyone that Muslims are able to be both citizens and rulers in democratic societies. Further, Indonesia should inspire people everywhere to stop fearing religion as a necessarily authoritarian and intolerant influence in a society, a prejudice about religion left over from the modern era. Indonesians can show the world that a return to some sort of belief in some idea of God can be the cornerstone of a truly democratic and tolerant society. Indonesians have proven themselves to be assimilationist and tolerant, as the citizens in Cordoba and Baghdad were. The world needs them to present another variety of democratic society, one workable option among many in our collective effort to form governments and societies where power is used to empower the citizens rather than to oppress them. So I just wanted, that was a speech I gave to Indonesians, but of course it applies to all of us. People all over the world need to learn these lessons, not only about the bridges between the three religions of the book, but the bridges between all the religions, which is this big step Indonesians can make. Um, and I just encourage us to relook at what the canonized books should be, what the Western canon should be, and then, of course, we need to move toward an international canon at this age, at this stage in the era of globalization.